The sun hadn't yet cleared the eastern horizon when the weathered Ford F-150 approached the gates of Camp Pendleton. The truck was old, not vintage old, which might have been charming but genuinely worn, as if it had driven through decades of America's forgotten roads without complaint. Its hunter-green paint was faded to the color of dried sage, and rust bloomed along the wheel wells like spreading diseases. But the engine purred with surprising smoothness, indicating someone who understood the philosophy of maintenance and patience. Behind the wheel sat James Caldwell, 73 years old, with hands that told a story of their own. His hands were weathered leather, brown, scarred, with fingers that moved with deliberate precision. Decades of handling instruments with exact specifications had left their mark: calloused fingertips, a slight tremor that came and went like visiting weather, and a grip that could still bend steel when the occasion demanded it. His face was a roadmap of his life. Deep lines around his eyes spoke of decades spent studying distant horizons. A scar ran along his left cheekbone, a souvenir from a shrapnel incident in 1991 that he rarely discussed. His silver hair was cut military short, a habit he'd never broken despite 3 decades of civilian life. He wore faded Levi's, a weathered brown jacket that had been patched multiple times, and boots, good boots, the kind that cost real money and lasted forever. But everyone's attention that morning would focus on what he carried. Caldwell pulled the truck into the designated parking area near the firing range at exactly 600 hours. The morning air was cool, carrying that particular clarity that comes only in the first hours of dawn. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the range, golden and silent. A few early arriving Marines were already gathering near the equipment stations, stretching, checking their rifles, running through pre-exercise protocols. Their bodies were young, hardened, efficient, the bodies of men and women trained to perfection in a single generation. As Caldwell climbed down from the truck, a process that took slightly longer than it might have for a younger man, favoring his right leg ever so slightly, he reached into the cab and retrieved the rifle case. The case itself was unremarkable, black, standard military issue from the 1990s, scuffed and worn. But when he opened it and removed the contents, several nearby Marines stopped their conversations and stared. The rifle was extraordinary, not in the way that military rifles were extraordinary, not in terms of tactical efficiency or standardized specifications. This rifle was extraordinary because it was clearly, unmistakably, a one-of-a-kind creation. The stock was burnt orange, a color that seemed almost offensive in its deviation from standard military protocol. Not the bright orange of safety equipment, but a deep, rich burnt orange that might have been chosen by an artist designing a sunset. The barrel was a work of precision engineering, its finish darker than standard, suggesting careful care and deliberate modification. The scope mounted on top was sophisticated, clearly custom, with controls and settings that suggested someone had thought very carefully about every detail. "What the hell is that?" Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez muttered to Lance Corporal David Chen, who stood beside him. Rodriguez was 26, from Phoenix, Arizona, with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for making fast judgments. Chen was younger, 22, from San Francisco, with something to prove and the arrogance that often accompanied that hunger. Chen's lip curled slightly. "Is that orange?" Rodriguez couldn't help it, he laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, but the laugh of someone observing something unexpected and unsettling. "Looks like something a civilian would build in his garage." "What is that, duct taped together?" The other Marines within earshot, there were perhaps a dozen gathered near the line, began to smirk. Their eyes tracked Caldwell as he carefully extracted the rifle from its case, cradling it with the reverence someone might show handling a Stradivarius violin. "Maybe his grandson painted it orange," Chen said, louder now, ensuring his comment traveled. "Thought it was a toy gun." Caldwell showed no reaction. His face remained neutral, not blank exactly, but empty of defensiveness. He examined the rifle in his hands with the thoroughness of someone conducting an inspection, checking the sight alignment, running his weathered fingers along the stock with almost affectionate care. Then he reached back into the case and withdrew several accessories. Ammunition boxes with handwritten labels, cleaning supplies that looked expensive and well-maintained, a small leather journal, and a portable wind meter that looked more like something from a meteorology lab than a shooting range. "Sir," another voice called out. This one belonged to Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Walsh, a woman in her mid-50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen combat in 4 different countries. She wasn't mocking. She was observing, assessing, her expression unreadable. "You here for the evaluation?" Caldwell looked up, and when he did, his eyes seemed to shift. They weren't unkind, but they were absolutely certain. The kind of certainty that comes from someone who has spent decades making decisions where mistakes meant death, not metaphorical death, but literal, final, no second chances death. "I am," he said simply. His voice was quiet, steady, with a slight rasp that suggested age or perhaps just a man who didn't speak often. "Colonel Mitchell invited me." At the mention of Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the conversation shifted slightly. Mitchell was no ordinary officer. She held a PhD in advanced marksmanship theory, had revolutionized several training protocols, and carried the kind of credibility that made younger officers listen carefully when she spoke. The fact that she had specifically invited someone to this evaluation meant something, but most of the Marines present didn't know that. They only knew an old man with an orange rifle. Caldwell walked toward the equipment stations with that same measured pace, neither hurried nor slow. Behind him, the Marines exchanged glances. Rodriguez was already forming jokes in his mind. Chen was genuinely curious and genuinely convinced this would be entertaining for all the wrong reasons. The others fell into the informal hierarchy of a military unit, some curious, some skeptical, some simply waiting to see what would happen. As Caldwell approached the main office building where Colonel Mitchell was stationed, he passed within a few feet of Rodriguez and Chen. They watched him go, that orange rifle catch the rising sun and throw back a dull glow that seemed almost deliberately designed to be ridiculous. Neither of them could have known that they were watching a living legend. Neither of them could have understood that the man they were mocking had spent 30 years in retirement, developing this single rifle to a level of precision that existed almost nowhere else in the world. Neither of them could have imagined that before the sun set that day, they would remember this moment with something approaching awe. Caldwell reached Colonel Mitchell's office and knocked twice precisely. She opened the door immediately, as if she'd been watching for him. Her smile was genuine, carrying the warmth of someone greeting an old friend. "James," she said simply, "thank you for coming. Today, I want to show them something they'll never forget." Behind him, across the grounds, the young Marines continued their preparations, unaware that history was about to be written on their range. The firing range at Camp Pendleton was a particular kind of organized chaos. By 7:30 hours, the morning had transformed into controlled activity, Marines in tactical gear moving between stations, equipment being checked and rechecked, the murmur of professional conversations filling the desert air. Colonel Mitchell had escorted Caldwell to the range, introduced him briefly to Major Harrison, the officer overseeing the evaluation, and then gracefully withdrew. She had work to do elsewhere, she explained, but her eyes told Caldwell she knew exactly what was about to happen. She seemed almost amused by it. The Marines began noticing him immediately. Caldwell had set up his equipment at Station 7, one of the primary firing positions that would be used throughout the day. But unlike the other Marines, who had standard-issue rifles, proper military range bags with organized compartments, and accessories that matched their weapons exactly, Caldwell had that orange rifle. It sat on his portable stand like a deliberately chosen statement, defiant in its nonconformity. "Hey, Rodriguez," Lance Corporal Chen called over, his voice carrying that particular timbre of someone who'd spotted something funny and wanted his friends to share the joke. "Check out the old guy's gun. Did he paint it himself?" Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez glanced over, and his eyebrows immediately rose. He was training to become a range instructor himself, someone who took marksmanship seriously, but he was also 26 years old and still young enough to find amusement in anything that deviated from expected norms. That's actually orange," he said, as if confirming something he wasn't quite sure he'd seen correctly. The comment spread like fire. Within minutes, 5 or 6 Marines had drifted closer, ostensibly to adjust their own equipment but actually to get a better look at the spectacle. Caldwell remained focused on his own preparation, methodically organizing his ammunition, checking his scope alignment, adjusting his wind meter. He didn't acknowledge the gathering audience or their whispered comments. "Did you see that thing?" Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Walsh asked her partner, Sergeant James Murphy, with genuine bewilderment. Walsh was a professional, 24 years in uniform, 3 tour in combat zones, twice divorced, with the kind of weathered competence that came from doing something well for a very long time. Even she seemed thrown by the appearance of the orange rifle. "Looks homemade," Murphy observed. He was younger than Walsh, maybe 40, with the compact build of someone who'd spent years in gyms and training facilities. "Like, genuinely homemade. I wonder if it even fires straight." But it was Rodriguez who decided to voice what everyone was thinking. Walking closer, his voice pitched to carry but not so loud that it would be obviously directed at Caldwell, he said, "Sir, did you pick that up at a yard sale? I've seen nicer rifles at civilian hunting stores." The Marines within earshot snickered. It wasn't malicious, not quite. It was the particular humor of young people observing something that seemed out of place, something that represented a deviation from their carefully maintained standards and protocols. These were elite soldiers, trained to precision, operating within systems designed to eliminate variables and maintain consistency. An old man with a homemade-looking orange rifle represented everything that stood outside that system. Caldwell glanced up briefly. His expression didn't change. He simply looked at Rodriguez for a moment, not angrily, not defensively, but with a kind of calm assessment, then returned to checking his ammunition. The dismissal was somehow more powerful than any response he might have given. "That's cold," Chen whispered, loud enough for nearby Marines to hear. He didn't even defend himself. But the initial mockery had broken the ice. Now jokes began to flow more freely. Lance Corporal Brian Schwartz, a young man from North Carolina who'd only been in the Marines for 18 months and still carried that desperate eagerness to fit in that came with being the newest member of his unit, decided to contribute. Maybe the orange is so his grandson can find it, like a toy gun at a toy store. The laughter that followed was louder, more confident. What had started as observations was becoming full-fledged mockery. Caldwell continued his preparations with absolute focus. He had drawn a small notebook, leather-bound, clearly old, its pages worn from use, and was scribbling notes. Wind direction, temperature, humidity. Basic calculations that any serious marksman would perform, but to the watching Marines, it looked like an old man writing in a diary. "Is he writing poetry?" someone asked. "Like he's communing with nature before his shot?" The joke landed, and fresh laughter rippled through the gathered onlookers. Even Gunnery Sergeant Walsh found herself smiling slightly, though her smile was tinged with something else, curiosity perhaps, or professional skepticism. She'd seen enough in her career to know that sometimes the most unusual packages contained unexpected contents, but she also understood the broader point. This man did not belong in this place. Rodriguez was warming to the performance. Clearly the unofficial leader of this informal mockery session, he continued, "I bet he bought that rifle at a craft fair. Handmade by local artisans. That's probably what the label said." The jokes proliferated. Chen speculated that maybe Caldwell was a Hollywood prop maker who'd brought his work to show to the Marines. Another Marine suggested that perhaps his retirement hobby was woodworking, and he'd gotten confused and brought his workshop project instead of an actual rifle. The humor was creative, sustained, and had that quality of group mockery where each new joke built on the previous one, creating momentum. What was remarkable was how completely Caldwell seemed to ignore it all. He didn't show irritation, didn't attempt to explain or defend himself, didn't demand respect. He simply existed in their presence, quiet and focused on his own work. For some of the Marines, this indifference was somehow more frustrating than defensiveness would have been. His calm suggested that their words simply didn't matter to him, that he inhabited a different space entirely. Major Harrison appeared at around 8:15 hours, conducting a final briefing before the evaluation would officially begin. He was a man in his early 50s, clearly career military, with the bearing of someone who'd made rank through competence rather than politics. He acknowledged Caldwell with a nod, not particularly warm or cold, just professional recognition. The Marines immediately sobered, though the smirks didn't entirely disappear. Caldwell stood, rifle in hand, and joined the assembled group for the briefing. He listened carefully as Major Harrison outlined the evaluation parameters. The standard tests would begin at 1,000 meters, progressing to 2,000, then 3,000. Various firing positions, accuracy measurements. The Marine marksmen gathered all seemed confident. They were, after all, the best shots in their respective units. They'd trained extensively. They knew their weapons intimately. As the briefing concluded and the Marines dispersed to begin the preliminary rounds, Rodriguez couldn't resist one final comment. Quietly, to Chen, he said, "I give him until the first round of shots before that thing falls apart. I'm genuinely curious what happens when someone who doesn't know how to build a rifle tries to fire it." But Caldwell had heard it, and somewhere deep in his weathered face, in the corners of his mouth that didn't quite smile but suggested the memory of a smile, there might have been something. Not offense, not anger, perhaps something closer to understanding. The understanding of a man who had waited a long time to remind the world of something it had forgotten about him. The morning sun climbed higher. The evaluation was about to begin. And somewhere in the gathered Marines, in the back of someone's mind, a small whisper of doubt had begun to form. Not yet fully articulated, not yet acknowledged, but present, like a shadow that wasn't quite where the light said it should be. Colonel Sarah Mitchell sat in her office, positioned strategically where she could observe the firing range through her expansive windows without appearing to do so. She had a doctorate in advanced marksmanship theory from Stanford University, published papers in military journals that most officers never read because the mathematics was too demanding, and a personal interest in the history of precision shooting that bordered on obsessive. She'd spent 18 months researching the most decorated marksmen in United States Marine Corps history, pulling declassified files, reading combat reports that had seen classified markings now removed, and studying the service records of men whose names had been nearly erased from institutional memory. James Caldwell was the centerpiece of her research. When she discovered that he was still alive, still living quietly on a ranch outside Missoula, Montana, she'd spent 3 weeks crafting the perfect message to lure him here. Not a direct appeal. That wouldn't work for a man like Caldwell. Instead, she'd sent Colonel Richard Hartman, Caldwell's former commanding officer, to make the personal invitation. Hartman had served with Caldwell during Operation Desert Storm. He'd seen things that still kept him awake at night, things he'd never fully documented in official reports. Caldwell had said yes within 3 hours of Hartman's visit. From her vantage point, Mitchell watched as Caldwell positioned his rifle for the preliminary tests. The Marines around him continued their snickering, completely unaware they were in the presence of something extraordinary. She knew the truth about that orange rifle. She'd spent weeks corresponding with Caldwell through encrypted email, asking detailed technical questions and understanding what he'd created. The burnt orange color wasn't a whim. It wasn't an aesthetic choice from a man who developed questionable taste in his old age. It was, in fact, a brilliantly calculated tactical decision rooted in decades of operational experience. During Caldwell's service in Somalia in 1993, He'd operated in night conditions where standard rifle colors disappeared into shadow, becoming invisible even to allies. The psychological and practical consequences of that invisibility, being unable to identify your own weapon in critical moments, having allies mistake your position, had taught him a lesson. Years later, when working in Kuwait during reconnaissance operations, he discovered that burnt orange registered perfectly under thermal imaging when standard colors blended into the background. The hue existed in a narrow band of the thermal spectrum that made it stand out like a beacon to infrared equipment, while remaining invisible to normal human vision in low-light conditions. It was the kind of insight that came only from someone who'd spent 30 years in the field, making life-and-death decisions based on equipment performance in extreme conditions. Mitchell had asked him directly in one of their correspondence sessions, "Why orange?" His response had been characteristically brief: thermal signature in the 814-micron range, invisible to naked eye at night, visible to equipment. Learned that lesson the hard way in Somalia, '93. The rifle itself was a symphony of precision engineering that few people on Earth could fully appreciate. Caldwell had designed and built it over the course of 2 years, working with master gunsmith Heinrich Weber in a small workshop outside Missoula. Weber was himself legendary in certain circles, a German immigrant who'd spent 40 years refining the art of rifle customization. He'd worked with Olympic shooters, precision competitors, and several individuals from intelligence agencies, whose work would never be acknowledged in official capacity. When Caldwell had first walked into Weber's workshop with sketches and specifications, Weber had studied the designs for 3 hours without speaking. When he finally looked up, he'd said simply, "This is art. This will take time." It had taken more than time. It had taken obsession. The barrel had been hand-forged and precisely weighted through a process that involved microscopic measurements and adjustments, not simply for accuracy. Any decent barrel could deliver accuracy, but for consistency. The barrel needed to shoot the same way in different temperatures, at different humidity levels, after different numbers of rounds. Caldwell had run 11,000 test rounds through various barrel iterations before settling on the final version. Each shot had been documented. Wind speed, temperature, humidity, air pressure, time of day, barrel temperature, ammunition batch number. 11,000 shots carefully recorded. The trigger mechanism was equally obsessive. A military standard trigger breaks at 4 to 5 pounds of pressure. Weber had helped Caldwell develop a trigger that broke at exactly 2.3 pounds, with zero creep and predictable reset. They'd tested it across temperature ranges from 40 below zero to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The trigger had performed identically in all conditions. The scope was where Caldwell had invested the most money and research. It wasn't a military-issued system. Instead, it was a custom construction that combined elements from 3 different manufacturers with modifications that only Caldwell had requested. The magnification could be adjusted with fingertip precision. The windage and elevation turrets had been calibrated to track with mathematical precision, each click representing exactly 0.25 minutes of angle, meaning that at 1,000 yards, each click moved the point of impact by 2.62 inches. But Caldwell had spent additional months ensuring that the relationship between scope adjustment and actual point of impact remained perfectly linear across the entire adjustment range. Total cost of the rifle, $47,000 in materials and labor. But the real cost was in time, in the hours Caldwell had spent learning ballistics, atmospheric physics, and the 1,000 variables that separated a good shot from an impossible shot. Mitchell had asked him why he'd invested so much into a single rifle. "Because," he'd written back, "if you're going to do something, do it perfectly. Otherwise, why do it at all?" The Marines had no concept of what they were looking at. To them, it was a strange-looking gun. To Mitchell, and to those few others in the world who understood this kind of precision, it was a masterwork. It was the physical manifestation of a man's entire philosophy of excellence compressed into steel, wood, and glass. She watched as Caldwell took position for his first shot at 1,000 meters. His breathing was controlled. His body position was textbook perfect, not because he was following a manual, but because his body had been trained to find optimal positioning through decades of repetition. His finger found the trigger with the familiarity of a concert pianist finding the right keys. Mitchell knew what was about to happen. The young Marines thought they were going to watch an old man embarrass himself. What they were actually about to witness was a master demonstrating his craft. And when they saw what this rifle could do in the hands of the man who designed and built it, everything would change. The moment approached. The rifle rose slightly as Caldwell's breathing synchronized with his preparation. Mitchell leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. 32 years since Caldwell had left the service. 32 years of the world forgetting who he was, and in approximately 4 seconds, that would end. The first shot shattered everything the Marines thought they understood. At 1,000 meters, the young Marines had expected Caldwell to struggle. Maybe he'd miss entirely. Maybe he'd hit the target but wildly off-center, proving his rifle was as useless as they'd assumed. Instead, when the downrange observers confirmed the shot, their report came back with barely concealed surprise. Direct hit, center mass, excellent grouping. Caldwell's next shot landed within inches of the first, then the third, and the fourth. Rodriguez watched through his binoculars, his expression shifting from amused to confused. Chen had stopped joking. The snickering that had characterized the morning had evaporated, replaced by something else, a growing sense of disquiet, as if the Marines had collectively agreed to a narrative, and that narrative was being rewritten in real time. "How is he doing that?" Schwartz whispered. The young lance corporal looked genuinely troubled, as if the laws of physics had been violated. "That rifle looks like it shouldn't even fire straight." By the time they moved to 2,000 meters, the atmosphere on the range had changed dramatically. The Marines' casual mockery had transformed into genuine professional curiosity. This was no longer funny. This was something else entirely. Caldwell's scores weren't just good, they were extraordinary. He was shooting tighter groups than most of the younger Marines, despite being the oldest person on the range by approximately 35 years. Major Harrison stood beside Colonel Mitchell at the observation station, his jaw tightening slightly with each confirmation of Caldwell's shots. Harrison was a career military man, not given to exaggeration or emotional display, but even he was beginning to recognize that something unusual was occurring. "His scores," Mitchell said quietly, handing Harrison the numerical readouts. "Compare them to the best we've seen from the unit's marksmen in the past 18 months. Harrison studied the numbers. A small muscle twitched in his cheek. "His groupings are tighter." "Significantly," Mitchell agreed. At 3,000 meters, the difficulty increased exponentially. Environmental variables multiplied. Wind became a major factor. Even tiny miscalculations in shooting position or sight alignment could mean misses. The young Marines struggled at this distance. Some shots missed the target entirely. Others landed wide. The pressure was visible on their faces. This wasn't a casual training exercise anymore. This was a legitimate evaluation, and they were being evaluated. Caldwell, however, seemed to move into a different state entirely. His shooting position became more deliberate. He spent longer analyzing wind patterns, using his handheld meter and his eyes to assess air currents invisible to the casual observer. His breathing became even more controlled, almost meditative. When he fired, the shots landed true. By the time the 3,000-meter evaluation concluded, the entire dynamic of the day had fundamentally shifted. The orange rifle wasn't a joke anymore. The old man wasn't a relic or an embarrassment. He was, objectively and measurably, the best marksman on the range. "We need to talk about the 5,000-meter proposal," Colonel Mitchell said to Major Harrison as they reviewed the results. Around them, the Marines were receiving their scores and beginning to understand the scope of their underestimation. Rodriguez had pulled Mitchell aside at one point, his expression contrite. "Colonel, is there something we don't know about this guy?" Mitchell had simply smiled. "Just watch." Now, as the afternoon sun climbed higher and the desert temperature began to rise, Mitchell broached the subject that had been her plan all along. She approached Major Harrison in his command post, her expression serious and professional. "I want to extend the evaluation," she said without preamble, "further than we discussed." Harrison looked up from his reports. "How far are we talking?" 5,000 meters. The Major's expression froze. 5,000 meters, that's theoretically possible, Mitchell interrupted. Practically never tested under field conditions. It would be unprecedented. It would be impossible, Harrison corrected, though his tone suggested he was stating a fact rather than a certainty. The variables at that distance, the margin for error is essentially non-existent. You'd need perfect conditions, perfect equipment, and a marksman with. He paused, glancing out at the firing range where Caldwell was methodically checking his rifle and reviewing his notes. "With skills we rarely see." "Exactly," Mitchell said. Harrison understood what she was suggesting without her needing to spell it out. This wasn't about military readiness or standard evaluation protocols. This was about discovering the absolute limits of human capability in precision shooting. It was about creating a moment that would either prove or disprove something Mitchell had theorized through months of historical research. "You believe he can do it," Harrison said. It wasn't a question. "I believe he built a rifle specifically designed for this kind of shot," Mitchell replied. "And I believe his entire career was preparation for exactly this moment." At that moment, the arrival of General Patricia Hartson changed everything. The general's vehicle pulled up to the command post with the kind of efficiency that suggested a purposeful visit rather than a random inspection. Hartson was a woman in her late 50s, with steel-gray hair worn in a tight military bun, and the bearing of someone who had commanded thousands of soldiers and made decisions that determined operational outcomes. She was respected throughout the Marines, not with the casual regard given to many senior officers, but with the kind of deep respect reserved for those who had earned their rank through genuine competence rather than political maneuvering. "Major Harrison," she greeted, approaching the command post. "Colonel Mitchell, I was in the area and decided to observe the marksmanship evaluation. I've been following the pilot program with considerable interest." Her eyes swept across the range, taking in the Marines, the equipment, and lingering for a moment on Caldwell, who had paused in his preparations to pay appropriate respects to the general's arrival. "General," Harrison replied formally, "we've completed the first 3 distance evaluations. The results have been surprising." Hartson's eyebrow rose slightly. "Surprising in what manner?" Mitchell stepped forward. "One of our participants has demonstrated exceptional capability at extreme distances. We were discussing the possibility of extending the evaluation parameters beyond our original scope." "To what distance?" Hartson asked. 5,000 meters, Mitchell said, watching for the general's reaction. Hartson's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of recognition that this number meant something significant. She had held enough command positions to understand that 5,000 meters represented something beyond normal military application. It was a distance where theory and practice separated dramatically. 5,000 meters, Hartson repeated thoughtfully. That's more than 3 miles. For a moving target situation, that would be theoretically extraordinary, Mitchell said, and practically unprecedented. "And you believe someone on this range can make such a shot?" Hartson's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. "I believe our marksman can," Mitchell replied, "if conditions allow." Hartson studied Caldwell for a long moment. The old veteran was aware of the general's attention, but didn't react to it. He simply continued his preparations with the focus of someone for whom such observations were part of normal operating procedure. "Very well," the general said finally. "Set up the target at 5,000 meters. Let's see what's possible." The words hung in the air, and immediately the range exploded into organized activity. Target placement teams mobilized. Downrange observation positions were established at a distance that pushed the limits of standard optical equipment. The Marines stopped their conversations and understood that something truly extraordinary was about to occur. Rodriguez walked over to where the general stood, his earlier confidence completely gone. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying something approaching awe, "is anyone actually expected to hit something at that distance?" Hartson glanced at him with a slight smile. "We're about to find out, Sergeant." The afternoon sun continued climbing, and somewhere on the range, an old man with a burnt orange rifle prepared to make a shot that would either be remembered for decades or dismissed as an impossible dream. The desert had gone completely silent. It was a silence that wasn't natural, that was almost unnatural in its completeness. The Marines had stopped moving. The vehicles had been positioned and powered down. Even the wind, that constant, invisible force that dominated long-distance shooting, seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Caldwell lay prone on the firing line, his body positioned with the exact precision that comes only from decades of repetition. His feet were slightly splayed, his shooting elbow perfectly aligned with his shoulder. His left arm provided stability, muscles tensed just enough to provide support without creating rigidity. His breathing had synchronized with a rhythm that had become second nature through thousands of hours of practice, slow, measured, perfectly controlled. The 5,000-meter target was invisible to the naked eye. At that distance, the human eye simply cannot resolve objects smaller than a few inches in diameter. The Marines watching through their high-powered scopes could see it only as a distant shape, a rectangle of white and black that represented either the greatest moment of Caldwell's life or the moment when reality would collide with an impossible dream. Caldwell's mind, however, was operating on an entirely different level. He had spent the previous 40 minutes analyzing the range conditions with the intensity of a physicist preparing an experiment. The wind at ground level was moving at 4 knots from the northeast. He'd measured this with his handheld meter. But wind at ground level was not wind at 5,000 meters. Wind patterns changed with elevation. At altitude, the wind might be stronger, weaker, moving in a slightly different direction. Caldwell had decades of experience reading these invisible patterns, understanding how air currents at sea level correlated with currents at height. The temperature was 83 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity was reading at 37%. The barometric pressure was exactly 29.92 inches of mercury. Each of these measurements mattered. Lower humidity meant denser air, which affected bullet trajectory. Temperature affected the expansion and contraction of every metal component in his rifle. Barometric pressure affected how the air itself would resist the passage of the bullet across 3 miles of desert. Caldwell had calculated the ballistic coefficient of his ammunition dozens of times. He knew that his specific rounds, manufactured by a handloader who understood precision better than any factory could, would drop approximately 483 inches over 5,000 meters. That was over 40 feet. The relationship between the scope's elevation adjustment and actual point of impact had been empirically determined through testing. He knew that his scope's adjustment of 175 clicks up from his 1,000-meter zero would place his point of aim at the correct elevation for 5,000 meters. But elevation was only part of the equation. Wind was the killer variable. At 5,000 meters, a wind that was imperceptible at ground level could drift a bullet off target by feet. The 4 knots Caldwell had measured would create wind deflection. Using his ballistic calculations, Caldwell determined that the 4-knot wind would drift his bullet approximately 32 inches. He adjusted his scope's windage accordingly. Then he waited. For 15 minutes, he simply lay there, observing, watching the way dust moved, observing the behavior of the distant heat shimmer that indicated air movement, reading the patterns of the desert the way an ancient tracker might read tracks in sand. There were subtle shifts in wind patterns. The wind that had been 4 knots appeared to be increasing to perhaps 4.5 knots. This was the kind of observation that existed at the edge of human perception, the kind of reading that separated good marksmen from legends. General Hartson watched from the observation post, standing beside Colonel Mitchell. The general's expression was impossible to read. She had been present for precision operations before, had seen trained specialists perform tasks that pushed human capability. But what she was witnessing now, the absolute concentration of an old man, the total absence of hesitation or doubt, the methodical preparation for a shot that existed in the realm of theoretical possibility, was something else entirely. "He's been lying there for 15 minutes, one of the young officers whispered. "Is something wrong?" Mitchell shook her head. "He's reading the wind. He's waiting for the optimal moment." At the 19-minute mark, Caldwell's body tensed slightly. Not much, barely visible to anyone watching casually. But to those who understood what they were seeing, it was clear. The moment was approaching. His right hand moved to the rifle. His finger found the trigger, not with the quick decisiveness of combat shooting, but with the deliberate precision of someone about to perform a concert. His breathing synchronized. 1 breath in, 1 breath out, 1 breath in. On the next exhale, he would fire. The rifle was perfectly still. His body was perfectly still. The desert seemed perfectly still. Then at some point that only he could perceive, the moment came. His finger moved. The trigger broke cleanly at 2.3 pounds of pressure, the exact specification he and Weber had calibrated over months of testing. The rifle didn't jump. It was controlled by his body position and hundreds of hours of practice firing identical rifles. The noise was a sharp crack, distinct and singular, a sound that seemed to travel across the desert and echo off the distant hills. And then silence returned. For a moment nothing happened. The Marines remained frozen. The general remained motionless. Caldwell held his position, the rifle still pressed against his shoulder, his eyes still aligned with the scope. At 5,000 meters, the bullet would take approximately 1.3 seconds to reach the target. During those 1.3 seconds, the universe existed in a state of quantum uncertainty. The bullet either hit or it didn't. Either the calculation was perfect or it was wrong. Either Caldwell's decades of experience translated into this moment or it didn't. The seconds stretched. General Hartson held a radio handset. Her eyes were fixed on the distant target, visible only through high-powered optical equipment. Around her, every Marine, every officer, every person on the range understood that they were waiting for confirmation of something that might never have been attempted before. 1.3 seconds, then 2 seconds, then 2.5 seconds. Then the radio crackled. The voice was distant, compressed through the radio transmission, but the words were unmistakable. "We have impact, target hit, direct hit on target." The words hung in the air, and for a moment no one moved. Then, slowly, people began to breathe again. The general's expression shifted subtly, not into a smile, but into something that suggested recognition of something extraordinary. "Impact confirmed," the radio continued, the observer's voice now carrying a note of something approaching awe. "The round impacted within 2 inches of the target center. I've never seen anything like that distance." Caldwell slowly withdrew from his shooting position. He didn't jump up triumphantly. He didn't celebrate or show any visible reaction beyond a slight exhalation. He simply disassembled his rifle with the same methodical care he'd used throughout the day, placing each component carefully in its designated location in his equipment case. Around the range, Marines began to move again. Conversations restarted, but they were different conversations now. They were filled with the language of people who had witnessed something that exceeded their capacity to fully process it. Colonel Mitchell approached Caldwell as he finished packing his equipment. She extended her hand, and he shook it firmly. "I told you," she said quietly. "One shot, that's all anyone ever needed." Caldwell nodded, but his eyes were on General Hartson, who was walking toward him across the desert floor, her uniform crisp, her bearing unchanged by what she just witnessed. She seemed to exist in a different space than the other Marines, not above them, but somehow outside the normal flow of events. The general had something to say, and everyone on the range understood that they were about to witness a moment that would become legendary. General Patricia Hartson stood motionless for approximately 15 seconds after the confirmation came through the radio. Those 15 seconds felt considerably longer to everyone watching her. A senior officer's reaction to an extraordinary event carried weight. It validated or dismissed what had occurred. If the general accepted what she'd witnessed as extraordinary, then it was. If she remained unmoved, then perhaps it was simply a fortunate shot, a lucky moment that didn't necessarily indicate genuine capability. But Hartson's face was slowly transforming into an expression that suggested she was processing something that exceeded her normal frame of reference. She looked at the distant target through the high-powered optical equipment one more time, as if verifying the confirmation. Then she lowered the binoculars and turned slowly toward Caldwell. Her movement was deliberate, measured, the kind of movement that a general could make when moving through their own institution. She didn't rush. She didn't appear excited or emotionally reactive. Instead, she moved with the quiet authority of someone who had seen combat, had made decisions that cost lives, and had earned the right to move through the world with absolute certainty. Colonel Mitchell stepped aside slightly as the general approached Caldwell. The entire range seemed to recognize that what was about to occur was significant, perhaps the most significant exchange of the day. Conversation stopped. Marines who had been collecting equipment paused. Even the desert seemed to hold its breath. Caldwell remained standing, rifle disassembled beside him, watching the general approach with the calm expression of someone who had, decades ago, transcended the emotional volatility that most people experienced in moments of high stakes. "Command Sergeant Major Caldwell," Hartson said, her voice carrying the clear, measured tones of someone accustomed to being heard in large spaces. It was not a question. She knew exactly who he was. "How long has it been since your retirement from active service?" Caldwell met her eyes directly, not with challenge or defensiveness, but with the straightforward honesty of a person who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. 32 years, ma'am. I retired in 1993, shortly after Operation Desert Storm concluded." 32 years, Hartson repeated, and something shifted in her expression. It was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a slight downturn of her mouth, but it suggested she was calculating something, weighing something in her mind. "And you've been building that rifle for how long?" 2 years, Caldwell replied, "with Master Gunsmith Heinrich Weber in Montana." The general turned slightly, regarding the disassembled rifle with new appreciation. "I've commanded Marine operations across 4 continents," she said, and the weight of that statement hung in the air. "I've overseen training programs that cost millions of dollars. I've evaluated weapon systems that represent the cutting edge of military technology. I've watched some of the finest marksmen in the world attempt extraordinary shots." She paused, and her eyes returned to Caldwell. "In all my years, and I've been doing this for 38 years, I have never witnessed anything like what I just saw." Around the range, the Marines had stopped pretending not to listen. This was the general speaking directly about what had occurred, and what she was saying carried institutional weight. This wasn't just praise. It was a statement from the highest authority present that what had happened was genuinely unprecedented. "That was the most incredible shot I've ever observed," Hartson continued, and her voice had shifted slightly, carrying something that might have been awe, though awe seemed like an insufficient word for what she appeared to be experiencing. In terms of pure technical difficulty, in terms of the margin for error, in terms of the probability that a human being could execute such a task, that shot shouldn't have been possible. It was possible, Caldwell said simply, and there was nothing arrogant in his statement. It was simply factual, the way someone might state that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. The conditions were favorable. The preparation was thorough. The rifle is adequate to the task. Something flickered in Hartson's expression, perhaps recognition of Caldwell's refusal to engage in false modesty, his absolute honesty about what he'd accomplished. "Your service record," she said. "I'm familiar with the broad outlines. The Gulf War, Somalia, intelligence operations I'm not entirely privy to the details of. The code name the Ghost. Is that accurate?" "Yes, ma'am," Caldwell replied. "But I don't think I've ever fully understood the scope of what you were capable of," Hartson continued. "Looking back at the historical records, the confirmed operations, the engagements where you provided support, I think I may have underestimated the magnitude of your skill." It was an extraordinary admission from a general officer. To admit underestimation was unusual. To admit it publicly, in front of junior Marines, suggested that Hartson was making a deliberate point, that what she had witnessed demanded acknowledgement, even if that acknowledgement required revising her previous assessments. "I had excellent training," Caldwell said, "and excellent leadership. Officers like Colonel Hartman, Colonel Mitchell. The institution gave me the opportunity to develop my capabilities." But even as he said it, everyone present understood the truth. The institution had provided the framework, but Caldwell had created something that transcended institutional training. The rifle itself was proof of that. It existed outside military specifications, outside standard procurement processes, built by an old man in a civilian workshop with a retired gunsmith. Hartson was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "I want to understand how you made that shot. Every calculation, every decision, every factor you considered. I want that documented. Colonel Mitchell can work with you on that." "Of course, ma'am," Caldwell agreed. "And more than that," the general continued, "I want to understand if this capability can be replicated. Not by you. I suspect what you've demonstrated is partially dependent on 32 years of your specific experience, but whether the methodologies, the approach, the training protocols that led to this could be systematized." "Possibly," Caldwell said, "though the human element is significant. Not everyone can do what I just did, but the principles could be taught. The systematic approach to variables, the discipline of preparation, the willingness to spend years perfecting a single skill rather than achieving quick competence in many skills." Around the range, young Marines were listening to this exchange. Rodriguez stood slightly apart from the others, his expression shifting between regret and fascination. Chen was shaking his head slowly, as if reassessing every assumption he'd made that morning. Even the most junior Marines, who had initially joined the mockery out of unit conformity rather than genuine contempt, seemed to be reconsidering their earlier commentary. Hartson glanced toward Colonel Mitchell, who was watching the interaction with satisfaction. Then she looked back at Caldwell. "I'm going to recommend that you consult with our training development team," the general said. "Not as a subordinate, not as someone returning to military service, but as a civilian expert. Your knowledge could reshape how we approach long-distance precision operations." She paused. "Is that something you'd be willing to do?" Caldwell considered the question for only a moment. "I would, ma'am, provided Colonel Mitchell coordinates the details." Mitchell nodded. She had already anticipated this outcome. She'd already drafted proposals for exactly the kind of arrangement Hartson was describing. As the general began to turn away, she paused and looked back at Caldwell one final time. 32 years, she said quietly. "And you've spent those years becoming better at something you were already legendary at. That's remarkable, Caldwell. That's the kind of dedication we need more of in this institution. "Thank you, ma'am," Caldwell said simply. As Hartson walked back toward her command post, the entire dynamic of the range had shifted. The old veteran wasn't an anomaly anymore. He was a resource, a teacher, a living connection to a standard of excellence that seemed almost lost in the modern military. The young Marines who had laughed at him that morning were beginning to understand that they had mocked not incompetence, but mastery. And the shot, that single impossible shot at 5,000 meters, had become the catalyst that would change everything. By that evening, the research had begun. The first to conduct comprehensive historical research was Rodriguez, who'd had the most direct interaction with Caldwell that morning. Rodriguez had spent 3 hours in the Camp Pendleton Records facility, pulling documents that had been declassified within the past decade, searching for anything with the code name The Ghost, and the name James Caldwell. What he found shocked him into a state of genuine remorse. The first confirmed engagement, Operation Desert Storm, 1991. A reconnaissance team pinned down by Iraqi forces, 3 soldiers critically wounded, an extraction impossible without suppressing fire. Caldwell had been positioned 2,800 meters away, on an elevated position that didn't provide clear sight lines to the enemy positions. He'd made adjustments for wind and elevation, calculated through exposed rock formations and weather patterns, and made 3 shots. All 3 hit. All 3 eliminated enemy combatants who had been directing heavy weapons fire at the pinned American team. The extraction succeeded. 3 soldiers lived. The second engagement, Somalia, 1993. A UN observer team was being actively hunted by hostile forces. The team was cornered in a residential compound. Caldwell had been brought in as support. He'd operated from a position 3,200 meters away, a distance so extreme that it was rarely acknowledged as possible during that era of military operations. He'd made 5 shots. 5 of the pursuing hostile forces were eliminated. The observer team escaped. And that was only the declassified material. There were references to other operations, other engagements, other situations where Caldwell's name appeared in redacted sections of after-action reports. The classified material remained sealed, but the implications were clear. James Caldwell had been legendary in his era. He was the sniper that other snipers studied. He was the standard against which others measured their capabilities. Rodriguez pulled his laptop and began searching military training databases. He discovered that Caldwell's name appeared in historical studies about precision shooting. Papers published in classified military journals referenced his techniques. Training protocols used at sniper schools across the Marine Corps contained methodologies that had been adapted from his documented approaches. He wasn't just a good marksman. He was a foundational figure in the modern understanding of long-distance precision shooting. But it got deeper than that. Rodriguez found interviews, brief ones, carefully redacted, where other snipers spoke about Caldwell. One quote from a Marine who'd served with him in Kuwait had survived into declassified records. Caldwell wasn't operating at the same level as the rest of us. We were playing a game within certain parameters. He seemed to be playing a completely different game, with completely different rules. The full scope of Caldwell's legend began to crystallize. The codename, The Ghost, wasn't just a nickname. It was a descriptor of his methodology. He appeared where he was needed, completed his mission, and disappeared from notice. Classified operations had apparently been entirely built around his capabilities. Intelligence agencies had recruited him for operations that had never been publicly acknowledged and likely never would be. When Rodriguez shared his findings with Chen, the younger Marine's expression shifted from embarrassment to something approaching awe. "We mocked this guy," Chen said quietly. "We mocked one of the most decorated marksmen in Marine Corps history. We made fun of his rifle while he was standing 20 feet away." "Did you know?" Chen asked Rodriguez. "Did any of us know?" "How could we?" Rodriguez replied. But even as he said it, he understood the answer was irrelevant. They'd mock someone they knew nothing about. They'd assumed incompetence based on appearance and unconventional equipment choices. And all the while, they'd been standing in the presence of living history. By the next morning, the news had spread through the entire base. Caldwell's service record had been shared, the parts that could be shared, and Marines across multiple units were requesting to meet him, to speak with him, to understand how someone achieved such excellence. The young soldiers who'd mocked him were experiencing something between embarrassment and profound respect. Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez approached Caldwell as the sun rose over Camp Pendleton. Caldwell was already at the range, preparing his rifle with the same methodical precision he'd shown the previous day. Rodriguez stood at a respectful distance for a moment, gathering his thoughts, trying to find the right words. "Sir," Rodriguez said finally, his voice carrying a tone that was completely different from his morning comments the day before, "I owe you an apology." Caldwell looked up from his work, his weathered face calm. "No apology necessary, Sergeant." "With respect, sir, it is necessary," Rodriguez pressed on. "I was disrespectful, I made assumptions. I mocked your equipment without understanding anything about you or what you were bringing to this evaluation." He paused. "I spent last night reading your service record, sir. I'm genuinely humbled. The operations you were involved in, the engagements where you made impossible shots, the training protocols you developed. You're a legend." Caldwell set down his rifle components carefully. "I appreciate that, Rodriguez, but I want you to understand something. I'm not offended by what happened yesterday. You're a young Marine. You and your peers were testing boundaries, establishing hierarchies, trying to understand your place in the world. That's normal. That's healthy in its way." He looked directly at the young sergeant. "What matters isn't that you mocked me. What matters is that when you discovered who I am, you took the time to understand. That's the mark of a good soldier, the willingness to learn when you've made an incorrect assumption." Rodriguez felt something shift in his chest. He'd expected anger or at least coldness. Instead, he'd encountered understanding. "Sir, I want to learn from you, if you're willing to teach." "I am," Caldwell said simply, "and you'll be an excellent student." Similar conversations occurred across the range over the following days. Chen approached with his own apology and request to learn. Gunnery Sergeant Walsh, the professional who'd maintained skepticism through the initial mockery, came seeking technical consultation. Even the newest Marines, who'd participated in the ridicule more out of unit conformity than genuine contempt, found themselves drawn to Caldwell with genuine respect. What was remarkable was Caldwell's response to all of them: complete acceptance, no bitterness, no need to make anyone feel worse than they already did. He understood military culture intimately. He understood that young people often joked about things they didn't understand, that hierarchies were established through banter and observation, that the respect he'd earned through his shot was far more valuable than any respect forced through anger or resentment. "Why aren't you angry?" Chen asked him directly one afternoon. "They mocked you. We all did. Why are you just teaching us like it didn't happen?" Caldwell set down the ballistics calculation he'd been reviewing. "Because anger would be a waste of energy and I have better things to do with my time," he said. "Besides, you didn't mock me, you mocked a perception of me. A perception built on incomplete information. Now you have better information. You're learning. That's the important part." But Chen understood there was more to it than that. Caldwell's lack of resentment wasn't naivete or weakness. It was the confidence of a man who had nothing to prove because his actions had already proven everything necessary. He didn't need their apologies to validate his worth. His worth had been established through decades of excellence. Colonel Mitchell watched these interactions from her office, satisfaction evident in her expression. This was what she'd hoped would happen, not just the recognition of Caldwell's skill, but the transformation of an entire unit's perspective. The young Marines who'd laughed at the orange rifle would now become stewards of his knowledge. They would carry forward his methodologies, his approach to excellence, his understanding that mastery required patience and dedication. By the end of the week, something had fundamentally changed on the range. The mockery had transformed into respect. The ridicule had evolved into genuine admiration, and Caldwell, rather than having his legacy finally recognized, was now actively shaping the next generation of marksmen. The old veteran with the orange rifle had moved from invisible to indispensable, and the Marines who'd laughed at him were becoming his students, his apprentices in the pursuit of excellence. 3 weeks after Caldwell's extraordinary shot, General Patricia Hartson signed the official documentation that would reshape Marine Corps marksmanship training across 12 different installations. The Caldwell Extreme Distance Protocol, a name Caldwell himself had deflected when Mitchell suggested it, represented a fundamental shift in how the military approached precision shooting at extended ranges. The protocol wasn't simply a collection of techniques. It was a philosophy that excellence requires patience, that mastery demands obsessive attention to detail, that success at impossible distances comes from understanding not just your weapon, but the atmospheric conditions, the mathematics of ballistics, and the psychological discipline required to perform under absolute pressure. It incorporated Caldwell's documented methodologies, his approach to analyzing environmental variables, and his systematic framework for converting theoretical knowledge into practical capability. But perhaps more importantly, the protocol included something that had never before been officially acknowledged in military training manuals: the value of individual expertise that exists outside standard specifications and institutional protocols. Colonel Mitchell worked directly with Caldwell to develop the training materials. They spent weeks in his Montana workshop, photographing his rifle from every angle, documenting his construction process, recording his explanations of every component's purpose. These materials became the foundation for a new training module that was implemented at Camp Pendleton, Fort Benning, Camp Lejeune, and 8 other major installations. Young Marines across the country began learning the principles that Caldwell had spent decades developing. Not all of them would achieve his level of capability. Very few humans possess the combination of natural talent, obsessive dedication, and decades of experience that Caldwell embodied. But many would push farther than they'd ever pushed before. Many would achieve shots that would have seemed impossible using traditional training methodologies. And all of them would understand that excellence requires dedication that transcends normal standards. The ripple effect extended beyond pure training. Officers began to reconsider how they evaluated and recruited talent. If someone like Caldwell, who had spent 32 years away from institutional military structures, could still perform at a level that exceeded contemporary standards, then perhaps there was value in looking beyond conventional career paths. Perhaps institutional service wasn't the only measure of a Marine's worth. Perhaps the marketplace of excellence existed in broader territory than formal organizational structures. General Hartson made an extraordinary decision. She established a formal consultant position specifically designed for Caldwell, with compensation, benefits, and authority that matched his expertise. The position carried no requirement for physical relocation, no obligation to report to base daily, and complete autonomy in determining how he contributed his knowledge. Caldwell accepted, though he negotiated to reduce his involvement to 2 weeks per quarter, allowing him to maintain his life in Montana. "I'm not interested in becoming military again," he told Mitchell. "I made my choice 32 years ago. What I'm interested in is ensuring that what I've learned doesn't disappear with me." Mitchell understood. The consultant arrangement gave Caldwell the opportunity to transmit his knowledge without requiring him to abandon the civilian life he'd chosen. He would return to Camp Pendleton 4 times per year, spending 2 weeks conducting advanced training, reviewing protocols, and mentoring Marines who showed particular aptitude. Between visits, he would consult remotely on training development and equipment specifications. The decision to keep the burnt orange rifle at Camp Pendleton wasn't Caldwell's, it was General Hartson's. She wanted the weapon preserved as an artifact, a physical reminder of what could be achieved when excellence met opportunity. The rifle was professionally photographed, its specifications documented in meticulous detail, and it was placed in a display case near the main training facility. A plaque beneath the display told the story in understated language. Custom rifle designed and constructed by Command Sergeant Major James the Ghost Caldwell, used to execute a successful shot at 5,000 meters on March 15, 2025. This weapon represents the pinnacle of precision engineering and marksmanship excellence. Young Marines who saw that display began asking questions. Instructors would tell them the story, not as a myth, but as documented history. They would explain that the old veteran with the orange rifle had made a shot that exceeded the capabilities of contemporary military hardware. They would explain that the man had spent 32 years improving skills he was already legendary at. And they would make a point that transcended marksmanship. That greatness doesn't fade with age, that wisdom arrives in unexpected packages, and that sometimes the most important lessons come from people the world had already written off. 6 months after the shot, Rodriguez had become one of the most successful trainees in the new Caldwell protocol. He spent extended time with the old sniper, learning not just technique but philosophy. Caldwell taught him about patience, about the discipline of observation, about understanding that every variable, every tiny detail that seemed insignificant, could determine the difference between success and failure. The thing about extreme distance shooting, Caldwell told him during one session, is that it forces you to understand the entire system. You can't just understand your rifle. You have to understand wind, temperature, humidity, air pressure, light refraction. You have to understand ballistics at a level that approaches physics. You have to understand your own psychology, your breathing, your heartbeat, your ability to focus when everything is at stake. He paused. And once you understand that system, once you really understand it, you realize that excellence in one area is just excellence in all areas. It's not compartmentalized. It's a unified philosophy. Caldwell returned to his Montana ranch each time with satisfaction evident in his bearing. He had accomplished what he'd set out to do, prove that excellence doesn't diminish with time, and establish a framework through which future generations could pursue their own versions of mastery. His work had become institutionalized, which meant it would outlast him. It would influence Marines who had never met him, who would never fire his rifle, but who would understand that their pursuit of excellence was connected to principles he had established. 2 years after the shot, a documentary was produced about Caldwell and his impact on military training. It was distributed to all Marine installations and became part of the training curriculum. Young soldiers watched a 75-year-old man explain his philosophy of excellence. They heard him describe his 2-year process of building a rifle. They saw footage of the shot itself, the moment when the bullet left the barrel and traveled over a mile through the desert air. But the most powerful moments in the documentary came when Caldwell spoke about his years away from the military. He explained that retirement had been necessary, that he'd needed time to discover who he was beyond military service, that the decades away had given him perspective that active service never could have provided. "I wasn't better during my service," he said directly to the camera. "I was different. I was more urgent, more immediate, focused on the present tactical situation. But I wasn't wiser. Wisdom came during the quiet years when I had time to think, to learn, to understand the deeper principles underlying the techniques I'd developed." General Hartson watched that documentary in her final months of service before retirement. She understood that Caldwell had given the institution something invaluable, not just training protocols, not just techniques, but a living example of what it meant to pursue excellence relentlessly, humbly, and across decades. When she retired, one of her final acts was to ensure that the Caldwell Extreme Distance Protocol would be protected in future training cycles, that the consultant position would be funded in perpetuity, and that the orange rifle would be maintained as a permanent artifact at Camp Pendleton. History is being made by people we often dismiss, she wrote in her final memo to the training command. We dismiss them because they don't fit our institutional expectations. We dismiss them because they operate outside our normal parameters. But history has a way of vindicating those we were wrong about. James Caldwell is proof of that. Make sure every Marine who comes through these facilities understands that lesson. Caldwell lived quietly in Montana, maintaining correspondence with Mitchell and Hartson, consulting quarterly with training commands, and occasionally firing his custom rifle on his private range, where he could see the mountains and feel connected to something larger than himself. He had proven what he needed to prove. He had shown that excellence doesn't age. He had demonstrated that a single moment of perfect execution could echo through history, changing institutions and inspiring people he would never meet. The old veteran with the orange rifle had accomplished what very few humans ever accomplish. He had created a legacy that would outlast him, that would influence generations, that would stand as permanent testimony to what humans could achieve when they refused to accept limitations.